Margaret Lawson felt the familiar chill of airport air conditioning as she clutched the worn leather handle of her suitcase, rolling it steadily through the terminal. At 78 years old, she had traveled more times than she could count, visiting children, grandchildren, and old friends in the years since her retirement. But today felt different. Maybe it was the quiet excitement of seeing her granddaughter for the first time in nearly a decade, or maybe it was just the weight of time settling into her bones. Either way, she had been looking forward to this flight for weeks. She had saved carefully for this moment, ensuring that for once she could indulge in a small luxury, a first-class seat, a comfortable journey, and a peaceful few hours in the sky. She reached the check-in counter and handed her ticket to a young woman with a polite but hurried expression. The agent barely glanced up before scanning it and nodding. "You're all set, Ms. Lawson. First-class boarding will begin soon. Enjoy your flight." A quiet sense of pride settled in Margaret's chest as she tucked the ticket back into her purse. It wasn't often that she allowed herself such indulgences. Years of hard work as a school teacher, a mother, a caregiver, had left little room for extravagance. But this trip was special. This trip was for her. The waiting area filled up quickly as more passengers arrived. Businessmen in sleek suits tapping away at their laptops, a young couple whispering excitedly to each other, a woman in oversized sunglasses scrolling through her phone. No one paid her any attention, and she was perfectly fine with that. She adjusted the strap of her purse and kept her eyes on the boarding gate, counting the minutes until she could sink into her seat and finally relax. "Passengers flying first class on Flight 382 to Atlanta, you may now begin boarding." Margaret stood, gripping the handle of her suitcase, and made her way to the front. A few other first-class passengers stepped forward as well, handing their tickets to the gate agent. The scanner beeped, confirming each passenger's seat. When Margaret reached the front, she passed her ticket to the agent, who scanned it with a quick nod and gestured toward the jet bridge. The hum of the airplane greeted her as she stepped onto the flight, the cool rush of air conditioning meeting the warmth of her skin. A flight attendant stood at the door, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. Madison Reed had been a flight attendant for nearly 10 years, moving through her routine with the efficiency of someone who believed she was in control. She nodded at the first few passengers as they stepped inside, barely looking up from her tablet. Margaret took her time walking down the narrow aisle, her fingers brushing the soft leather of her seat as she found her place in first class. She placed her purse on the cushion, then carefully tucked her suitcase into the overhead compartment. The seat was wide and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cramped spaces she was used to in economy. With a small sigh of relief, she eased into it, letting her tired body sink into the comfort she had paid for. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph, her granddaughter Elise, at 5 years old, standing in front of their old home, her pigtails bouncing as she grinned at the camera. Margaret traced the edges of the photo with her thumb, allowing herself a moment of quiet nostalgia before tucking it back inside. But the moment didn't last. "Excuse me, ma'am." Margaret looked up to find Madison Reed standing beside her, arms crossed, a slight frown on her face. "I think you might be in the wrong seat," the flight attendant said, her voice clipped, professional, but with an unmistakable edge. Margaret blinked in confusion, reaching for the ticket still tucked into her purse. "Oh, I don't believe so. This is my seat." Madison didn't even glance at the ticket before shaking her head. "First class is reserved for paying passengers," she said, the words slow and deliberate, as if explaining something obvious. "Are you sure you didn't mean to sit in the main cabin?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the small piece of paper in her hands. She could feel it now, the shift in tone, the assumption, the unspoken message behind the words. It wasn't about the ticket. It wasn't about a mistake. She straightened her back, her voice steady. "I paid for this seat. This is where I belong." Madison sighed, clearly growing impatient. A few passengers nearby had turned their heads, their conversations quieting as the exchange unfolded. Some looked curious, others quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved. The flight attendant leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but keeping the authority in her tone. "Let's not make this difficult. I can help you find your real seat." The words hit Margaret harder than she expected. Real seat. As if she had wandered in by accident. As if she didn't belong here. A slow burn settled in her chest. She had been polite. She had followed every rule. And yet, here she was, being asked to move from a place she had rightfully earned. She inhaled through her nose, keeping her voice even. I won't be moving. I have my ticket, and this is where I am supposed to sit. Madison's expression stiffened. It was clear she hadn't expected resistance. She straightened, adjusting the collar of her uniform. I'll be right back, she said curtly, before turning on her heel and walking toward the front of the plane. Margaret remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the armrest. But inside her mind was far from calm. She could feel the whispers growing around her. She could feel the weight of every gaze. She had done nothing wrong, but somehow she already knew this wasn't over. Margaret Lawson had never been a confrontational woman. She had spent a lifetime moving with quiet dignity, teaching children the value of patience, kindness, and respect. She believed in rules, in structure, in doing what was right. But as she sat there in seat 3A, her fingers still gripping the smooth paper of her boarding pass, she realized something deeply unsettling. Doing what was right didn't always mean being treated right in return. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick, stretching between the quiet hum of the airplane's engines and the weight of a moment Margaret had never expected to find herself in. She had been challenged before, of course, by store clerks who assumed she was lost, by bank tellers who spoke slower when they saw her gray hair, by strangers who assumed she didn't belong in certain places simply because of how she looked. But never here, never in a space she had paid to be in, surrounded by people who had no reason to question their own presence. Yet here she was. Across from her, Madison Reed's smile had vanished, replaced by something colder. Something just a shade short of frustration, but laced with an expectation that was impossible to ignore. Move. Comply. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Margaret inhaled slowly, steadying herself. I won't be moving, she repeated, her voice even. I have my ticket, and this is my assigned seat. For a split second, something flickered in Madison's eyes. Surprise, perhaps. As if she had expected the old woman to nod politely, apologize for the inconvenience, and shuffle off to wherever she was supposed to be. Madison had likely done this before, perhaps not in such an obvious way, but in those little dismissive ways people often do when they assume too much and listen too little. She hadn't expected resistance. Margaret saw it then, the shift in Madison's posture, the way her fingers twitched at her sides before smoothing over the hem of her crisp uniform. She was recalculating, looking for another way to regain control. The flight attendant's authority had never been challenged by someone like her before. A quiet hush had settled over the cabin. Margaret felt it, the slight pause in conversation, the way the businessman 2 rows ahead had stopped typing on his laptop, how the woman in the window seat across from her pretended to be focused on the safety pamphlet in her hands. They were watching. They all knew what this was, but no one spoke. Margaret kept her spine straight, her chin lifted, her grip on the armrest firm but calm. She would not let her hands tremble. She would not let her voice waver. She had done nothing wrong, and yet a slow, sinking feeling curled in her stomach, the all-too-familiar weight of being put in a position where she had to prove she belonged. Madison exhaled sharply, her professional demeanor barely masking the tension in her voice. I'll be right back, she said curtly, before spinning on her heel and disappearing toward the front of the plane. Margaret remained still, but inside, her pulse drummed like a quiet war drum. She could feel the eyes on her now, some sympathetic, others indifferent. Some passengers had returned to their conversations. Others continued pretending they hadn't heard anything at all. That was always the way of it, wasn't it? People saw, people knew, but very few would speak. The moment stretched. She could hear Madison's voice up front, though the words were muffled by the low hum of the engines. Margaret exhaled slowly, flexing her fingers against the armrest. A younger version of herself might have been rattled by this moment, might have second-guessed herself, might have wondered if she had, somehow, made a mistake. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She had earned this seat, and she would not be moved. The whispers grew quieter. The energy in the cabin shifted. It was a slow, creeping thing, the kind of unease that settled into people's bones when they knew something wasn't right but couldn't quite name it. A businessman adjusted his tie. A woman glanced between Margaret's seat and the front of the plane. The young woman across the aisle, Celeste Navarro, lowered her phone, her gaze sharp, assessing. They were waiting. Margaret was waiting. And then, from the front of the plane, Madison returned, but this time she wasn't alone. The moment the captain stepped into view, the tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too tight. Captain Reuben Vaughn was not a man who wasted words. With graying temples and the quiet authority of someone who had spent more years in the sky than some of his crew had been alive, he carried himself like a man who tolerated very little nonsense. His sharp blue eyes scanned the cabin quickly before settling on Madison, then on Margaret. Margaret watched as the captain's gaze flickered, as recognition settled into his features. And then he smiled. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice warm but firm. "Good to see you again." Margaret returned the smile, slow and measured. "Captain Vaughn," she replied. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Celeste's eyebrows lifted slightly. Madison's shoulders went rigid. The captain turned to Madison, his expression unreadable. "I flew Mrs. Lawson to New York last spring. She's been a frequent flyer for years." Madison's lips parted, as if the words had momentarily caught in her throat. The realization settled over her like a storm cloud. Margaret didn't need to prove anything. Madison had simply assumed. The silence stretched between them, a silent verdict passed without a single word. Margaret could see it in the way Madison's fingers twitched at her sides, the way her mouth pressed into a tight line, the way her carefully controlled mask faltered for just a second. Captain Vaughn sighed, shaking his head slightly. Then, in a voice that left no room for argument, he said, "There is no issue here. Mrs. Lawson is exactly where she belongs." Margaret had won, but she knew this wasn't over, because people like Madison never expected to be challenged. And now that she had been, she was about to lose everything. Celeste Navarro had always been someone who noticed things. It was a habit born from years of being the quiet observer, the one in the back of the classroom who saw everything, every whispered conversation, every unspoken slight, every moment that went ignored. It wasn't that she was looking for trouble. It was that trouble always had a way of standing right in front of her, expecting no one to see it. And today trouble had a name. Madison Reed. Celeste had been seated just across the aisle from Margaret Lawson when the first sharp words had been spoken. At first, she hadn't thought much of it. Flight attendants checked tickets all the time, right? Maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe this was nothing. But then she saw the way Madison stood over Margaret, the way she never even looked at the ticket before making her decision. And she felt it, that shift in the air, that unspoken assumption. Margaret was older, a woman of color, dressed simply, sitting in a space that, in Madison's eyes, she didn't belong in. Celeste had seen that look before. She had felt that look before. She remembered being 16, walking through an upscale department store, just browsing, when a security guard started following her. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even touched anything, but that hadn't mattered. She remembered gripping her backpack tighter, feeling her pulse race, suddenly hyper-aware that someone had already decided who she was without knowing a thing about her. She had said nothing that day, but today she was done being quiet. Celeste grabbed her phone, her heart thudding as she tapped the record button. She didn't move, didn't shift in her seat, just held the camera steady. Margaret's voice was calm but firm. "I won't be moving. I have my ticket, and this is my assigned seat." Madison's face barely concealed her irritation. She turned quickly, stiffly. "I'll be right back." Celeste tracked her movement with the camera, watching as Madison stormed toward the front of the plane, her steps quick and sharp, her posture rigid with the anger of someone who wasn't used to being questioned. Margaret sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. But Celeste saw the way her fingers trembled just slightly. It was so subtle, so easy to miss. But Celeste didn't miss things, and it made her stomach twist. Margaret wasn't afraid. No, this wasn't fear. This was tiredness, a kind of exhaustion that came from years of moments like this. How many times had this happened to her before? How many times had she been questioned first and listened to second? How many times had she been forced to prove she belonged somewhere she had already paid to be? Celeste swallowed, her grip tightening around the phone. Not this time. She flicked her gaze toward the passengers around her, waiting to see if anyone else would react. A businessman a few rows ahead adjusted his tie, glancing up from his laptop but saying nothing. A woman in sunglasses peered over her magazine but quickly turned away. A middle-aged man looked toward Margaret, his expression uneasy, but he too said nothing. Celeste felt her teeth grind together. They saw, they all saw, in still silence. She turned her attention back to the screen just as Madison returned, but this time she wasn't alone. The captain was with her. Celeste's pulse jumped. Oh, now this just got interesting. She angled her phone just enough to capture everything. Captain Reuben Vaughn was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying temples and the kind of presence that demanded attention without a single word. He didn't have to raise his voice to command authority. It was simply who he was. And the moment he saw Margaret, his entire face changed. Recognition, warmth, respect. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice carrying just enough weight for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Good to see you again." Margaret gave a small, measured smile. "Captain Vaughn." Madison stiffened beside him, her body going unnaturally still. Celeste grinned. Oh, she just realized she messed up. The captain turned to Madison, his blue eyes sharp. "What's the problem here?" Madison hesitated. Celeste caught it. The moment Madison knew she had no excuse. Madison hadn't checked the ticket, hadn't bothered to ask questions. She had jumped to the conclusion immediately, so certain, so confident. Now she was standing beside a man who already knew the truth before she even opened her mouth. Madison's lips parted as if she was about to speak, about to say something that could salvage her dignity. But before she could even try, the captain cut her off. "There is no issue here. Mrs. Lawson is exactly where she belongs." Silence. A heavy, weighted silence. The businessman ahead finally closed his laptop. The woman in sunglasses sat up straighter. The middle-aged man glanced between Madison and the captain, his expression shifting from unease to something closer to realization. Celeste's phone screen flickered. She stopped the recording and immediately uploaded it. She didn't caption it, didn't add commentary. The video spoke for itself, and as it started to spread, seconds, minutes later, she could already feel it. This wasn't going to be ignored. The world was about to see exactly what she had seen. And Madison Reed, she had no idea what was coming. Captain Reuben Vaughn had seen his fair share of conflicts at 30,000 feet. He had mediated between impatient travelers, handled medical emergencies mid-air, and even once calmed a terrified passenger who tried to open an exit door mid-flight. He had spent decades in the sky, navigating turbulence, both in the air and among the people in his cabin. But as he stepped into the first-class section of Flight 382, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Madison Reed, he knew this was different. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was about assumption. This was about power. And most importantly, this was about justice. He had heard the conversation before he even reached the aisle. The sharp-edged certainty in Madison's voice. The clipped, dismissive way she had spoken to the elderly woman in seat 3A. A woman he recognized. A woman who belonged here. Captain Vaughn's stomach tightened as he approached, his every step deliberate. He saw Madison standing stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression trying, failing, to remain neutral. And then he saw Margaret Lawson sitting in her seat, calm, dignified, but with that unmistakable weight in her posture. That weight he had seen before. The weight of someone who had been here before. He inhaled deeply, pushing down the simmering anger rising in his chest. He wasn't going to raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth would be enough. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice firm yet warm. "Good to see you again." The reaction was instant. A ripple of confusion. A murmur of realization. Margaret turned, her eyes settling on him, and for the first time since this ordeal had begun, something softened in her expression. She recognized him too. "Captain Vaughn," she replied simply, as if greeting an old friend. Captain Vaughn had flown Margaret before. He had seen her board planes countless times, always carrying herself with grace, never causing a disturbance, always treating the crew with quiet respect. He had spoken with her once before about her travels, about how she used to be a school teacher, about how her granddaughter was in college now. He knew her, and he knew without a doubt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He turned then, slowly, deliberately, to face Madison. "What's the problem here?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Madison hesitated. The flicker of panic in her eyes was subtle, but it was there. She had expected Margaret to comply. She had expected no resistance. She had expected to be right. But now she had nothing. Madison started, her voice faltering just slightly. There was a seating issue. I wanted to confirm. Captain Vaughn raised a hand, cutting her off. Did you check her ticket? Madison's throat bobbed. I asked to see it. Captain Vaughn's eyes darkened. And did you look at it? Silence. Madison's jaw clenched slightly, the reality settling over her like an unbearable weight. She hadn't. She had made a decision before even seeing the proof. Captain Vaughn sighed, shaking his head slightly before turning back to Margaret. Mrs. Lawson, may I see your ticket? Without a word, Margaret reached into her purse and handed it to him. He took it, looked at it, and then, just to make it clear to everyone in the cabin, he read it aloud. Seat 3A, first class, paid in full. A hush fell over the cabin. The businessman a few rows ahead exhaled sharply. The woman in sunglasses lowered them slightly, watching with open curiosity. The middle-aged man who had previously looked uncertain now shook his head. Passengers who had once stayed silent were starting to see. This wasn't about a ticket. This wasn't about seating. This was about who was being questioned in the first place. Captain Vaughn handed the ticket back to Margaret with a small nod. You are exactly where you belong, Mrs. Lawson. Margaret took it, her expression unreadable, but in the depths of her eyes, beneath all the composure, there was something there, something rare. Something that people like her didn't get to feel very often in situations like this. Vindication. Captain Vaughn turned his gaze back to Madison, and for the first time, she broke eye contact first. I expect my crew to treat all passengers with professionalism and respect, he said, his voice steady but unyielding. I will not tolerate assumptions that lead to the humiliation of a paying customer. The words struck hard. Madison's breath hitched. Sir, I don't want to hear excuses, Captain Vaughn cut in, his voice final. We will discuss this further when we land. That was it. The verdict had been given. The gavel had fallen. Madison had lost. And Margaret? She had won. The first-class cabin remained silent, the energy in the room shifting in ways that were palpable. The unspoken agreement that had once kept passengers quiet had been broken. Celeste Navarro, still holding her phone, glanced up from her screen and smirked. Madison took a small step back, the color drained from her face. She turned stiffly, as if trying to regain some sense of dignity, and walked toward the front of the plane. Captain Vaughn watched her go, his gaze unreadable. Then he looked back at Margaret and gave a small, respectful nod before stepping away. The moment he was gone, the silence shattered. A single slow clap, then another, until the entire first-class cabin was applauding. Margaret inhaled sharply, her fingers trembling just slightly against her lap. She wasn't sure how to react. She wasn't used to being defended like this. Celeste grinned, leaning forward just enough to whisper, Looks like the internet is about to love you, Miss Lawson. Margaret let out a slow breath, shaking her head. I don't want attention, she murmured. Celeste tilted her phone screen toward her. The video was already gaining traction. It's too late for that, Celeste said with a smirk. And Margaret, for the first time in a long time, she didn't mind being seen. Madison Reed had spent years believing that the rules protected her, that as long as she followed protocol, as long as she wore her uniform with pride and carried herself with authority, nothing could touch her. But as she stood alone in the galley, her hands trembling around the phone receiver, she realized how terribly wrong she had been. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of finality. This is Daniel Henshaw, Senior Director of Airline Compliance, the man said, his words clipped and direct. We need to have a conversation about what's happening on this flight. Madison's breath caught in her throat. This was worse than she had expected. It wasn't just a passenger complaint. It wasn't just an uncomfortable situation that would be brushed under the rug once the plane landed. Corporate was already involved. She swallowed hard, her grip tightening around the phone. Sir, Miss Reed, Daniel interrupted, his tone sharp. We've received multiple reports regarding your treatment of a first-class passenger. A video of the incident is circulating online. I suggest you choose your words carefully. Madison's stomach dropped. A video. She hadn't even considered that someone might have recorded her film, that the entire world might be watching right now. She opened her mouth, desperate to regain control. I was just... Daniel cut her off again. Did you verify the passenger's ticket before asking her to move? Madison's skin burned. I was going to, but you didn't. A suffocating silence filled the line. Madison's pulse pounded in her ears. She felt cornered, like a trapped animal with no way out. I was following protocol, she said, her voice tight, desperate. That's not what it looks like, Daniel said coldly. And unfortunately for you, perception matters more than intent. Madison's knees felt weak. She had been so certain, so sure, that she could justify her actions, that she could explain this away. But Daniel Henshaw wasn't interested in explanations. He was here to deliver a verdict. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Madison's breath hitched. Sir, please. You will remain on board as a passenger, but you are no longer authorized to act as crew. Another flight attendant will take over your responsibilities. When the plane lands, you are to report directly to corporate for further action. Madison felt like she had been punched in the gut. Relieved of duty, no longer authorized, she had spent 10 years climbing the ranks, building her authority, ensuring that no one ever questioned her. And now, with a few words, it had all been stripped away. Daniel wasn't done. This decision is final, Miss Reed, he said. Captain Vaughn has already been informed, and Jonas will be taking over your responsibilities. Madison's breath shuddered. Jonas. She had spent years outranking him, years dismissing him, treating him like he wasn't her equal. And now she had to watch him replace her. Do you understand? Daniel asked. Her throat was dry. Her voice felt small when she finally whispered, Yes, sir. The line went dead. Madison stood there, frozen. The phone still pressed to her ear as if she could undo the conversation if she just held onto the receiver long enough. She couldn't. And when she turned, Jonas was already there. He had heard. He had seen. He knew. And unlike before, when Madison had always been the one in charge, the one giving orders, it was Jonas who spoke first. I'll take over from here, Madison, he said, his voice neutral. You should find yourself a seat. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. There were no arguments left, no explanations, no more control. Without another word, she turned stiffly and walked out of the galley. The moment she stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt it, the shift. Passengers who had once watched her with unease now looked at her with knowing. Margaret Lawson sat calmly in seat 3A, her expression unreadable. But Celeste Navarro? She was smirking. Madison burned under the weight of it. She hurried down the aisle, keeping her eyes forward, ignoring the whispers, trying to block out the reality of what had just happened. She had entered this flight as a senior flight attendant, a woman with authority. Now, she was just another passenger. She reached an empty seat in economy, sat down, and stared blankly ahead. For the first time in her career, for the first time in her life, she was not in control. And the worst part? She had done it to herself. Madison Reed had barely buckled her seatbelt in economy before the world began to burn around her. It started with a single post, a short video uploaded by Celeste Navarro, capturing every moment of her humiliating confrontation with Margaret Lawson. The clipped tone in Madison's voice, the dismissive wave of her hand when Margaret tried to show her ticket, the way she didn't even bother to look before deciding the elderly woman didn't belong in first class. And then, the moment of reckoning. The moment Captain Vaughn shut her down with a few well-placed words. The moment justice was served at 30,000 feet. Celeste didn't add much commentary. She didn't need to. She simply uploaded the clip in with a single caption. This is what happens when you assume who belongs and who doesn't. The internet did the rest. In less than an hour, the video had hundreds of thousands of views. By the time the plane was halfway through its flight, it had crossed the 1 million mark. And it was still climbing. People weren't just watching. They were commenting. They were angry. They were furious. This woman paid for first class, and she still gets treated like she doesn't belong? Disgusting. Fire that flight attendant immediately. This isn't just bad service. It's blatant discrimination. Margaret Lawson is all of us. The world owes her an apology. It wasn't just random internet users adding to the uproar. Celebrities, journalists, activists, big names were weighing in. sharing the video, calling out the airline. And then, the moment that turned this from an online scandal into a full-blown corporate nightmare. The airline's official account was tagged in thousands of replies, users demanding answers, calling for boycotts, vowing to never fly with them again. At first, the company stayed silent, a deadly mistake, because silence in the age of social media is just another word for guilt. By the time the airline finally responded, it was already too late to contain the damage. Their first attempt at damage control was a weak, hollow statement, obviously thrown together in a hurry. We take all customer concerns seriously and are currently investigating the incident that occurred on Flight 382. Our goal is to provide a welcoming experience for all passengers, and we appreciate your patience as we review the facts. It didn't go well. Investigating, we saw the video. What else do you need? Provide a welcoming experience, except when it comes to women like Margaret Lawson, right? So basically, you're waiting for people to forget? They weren't forgetting. They were getting angrier. Passengers from a previous flight started sharing their own experiences, moments where they had felt unfairly questioned, ignored, dismissed. One woman uploaded a clip of herself describing how she had been downgraded from business class after a flight attendant insisted she had bought the wrong ticket. Another shared screenshots of a customer service complaint she had filed months ago after being pulled aside for additional verification on a fully booked, oversold flight where she was the only person asked to prove her seat. This wasn't just about one moment anymore. This was about a pattern, and the world was taking notice. While the internet raged, inside the airline's headquarters, panic had set in. Daniel Henshaw, the senior director of airline compliance, had been fielding calls nonstop. The PR team was scrambling. The CEO had canceled meetings. And the head of legal? Furious. "This is not a minor incident," she snapped, slamming a printed transcript of online comments onto the conference table. "This is a potential class action lawsuit waiting to happen." Daniel exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "We need to respond fast." "We already did," the VP of Communications muttered, and it only made things worse. Someone refreshed their company's Twitter page. Over 50,000 comments under their latest post. And counting. Another executive spoke up, voice tight. "What are we doing about the flight attendant?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "She's already been removed from duty." "That's not enough," someone snapped. "People want blood." The CEO, a silver-haired man who had never seen a crisis explode this fast, rubbed his temples. "If we fire her now, we look like we're folding under pressure. If we don't fire her," legal cut in, "we might lose millions." Silence. Then, the decision was made. Daniel nodded grimly. "We need to announce her suspension. Immediately." Madison had no idea how bad it had gotten. She knew the call with Daniel had been devastating. She knew being relieved of duty had been the worst moment of her career. But she didn't know that by the time her plane landed, her name would already be plastered across news headlines. That the airline had just released a second statement, this time naming her directly. After reviewing the incident on Flight 382, the flight attendant in question has been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation. We do not condone discrimination in any form and remain committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. Madison's phone buzzed. A message from a friend. "You need to check Twitter. Now." Her hands shook as she unlocked her phone. Her name was everywhere. Trending. Not in a good way. Her breath came faster, shallow and uneven. She clicked on the latest news article. Her stomach turned to stone. Flight attendant suspended after humiliating ESE elderly woman. Public demands termination. The comments were brutal. People calling her a racist, a bully, saying she should never work in the airline industry again. Her career wasn't just in danger, it was over. And the worst part? For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she realized they might be right. Madison Reed had always loved the feeling of stepping off a plane after a flight. It was supposed to be a moment of pride, a moment where she adjusted her uniform, smoothed down her blazer, and walked with the confidence of someone who belonged. But today, she was barely breathing as she stood at the front of the aircraft, frozen, while the passengers deplaned. She could hear the murmurs behind her, the whispers that weren't even attempting to be discreet anymore. "That's her, right? I saw the video. Wow. She looks nervous. Wish, Mom. Wouldn't you be? She's about to lose everything. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. She wanted to turn away. She wanted to vanish, but there was nowhere to hide. A few feet ahead of her, Margaret Lawson moved with grace, stepping through the doorway and into the jet bridge. She wasn't hurrying. She wasn't shaken. She walked steadily, like a woman who had seen too much in her lifetime to let one humiliating moment define her. But for Madison, that moment had defined her. It had ruined her. Margaret didn't acknowledge her as she passed, didn't throw a smug glance over her shoulder, didn't gloat in her victory. But that somehow made it worse. Because if Margaret had been angry, if she had demanded revenge, maybe Madison could have justified her mistakes in her own mind. But she hadn't. She had simply existed. Madison Reed sat in the small, stifling office, staring blankly at the manila folder on the desk in front of her. Her name was printed neatly across the top, but she didn't dare reach for it. Her hands trembled in her lap. She had been summoned here the moment she stepped off the plane. No time to breathe, no time to process. Straight from one humiliation to the next. The walls of the office were stark, clinical. No decorations, no warmth. Just a room designed for bad news. Across from her, Daniel Henshaw, Senior Director of Airline Compliance, was flipping through pages of her career as if skimming the obituary of a life she hadn't even realized was already dead. Next to him, a woman in a navy suit, Patricia Langley from Human Resources, sat with a neutral expression. The kind of look people practiced when they were about to ruin someone's life, but didn't want to make it personal. Madison had seen this play out before, just never from this side of the table. The silence stretched, unbearable. Then Daniel sighed, finally setting the folder down. He folded his hands together on the desk, fixing her with a gaze that made her stomach clench. "Miss Reed," he began, voice measured. "Do you understand why you're here?" Madison swallowed hard. "Because of the incident on the flight." Daniel nodded but didn't break eye contact. "Because of several incidents." Her body tensed. I don't understand." Patricia shifted, placing a single page in front of her. A printed email. Subject, complaint regarding flight 243 March 2023. Madison's blood ran cold. Patricia slid another page forward. Subject, customer service concern. First class experience, November 2022. Another. Subject, alleged discrimination report, August 2021. One after another, they stacked in front of her like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was part of. "This isn't just about what happened today," Daniel said, voice firm. "This is about a pattern that, until now, had never been reviewed because there was never video evidence." Madison's mouth went dry. "But now," he continued, tapping the growing pile of complaints, "now we're looking." She couldn't breathe. For years, she had been strict. She had enforced the rules. She had told herself she was being professional, that her job was about order and standards. But now, as she stared at the complaints, she realized the truth. She hadn't enforced the rules fairly. She had enforced her assumptions, and they had finally caught up to her, her hands clenched into fists. I wasn't aware of these complaints." "That doesn't mean they didn't happen," Patricia said smoothly. Madison's pulse pounded in her ears. Daniel cut her off. "In multiple reports, passengers described feeling singled out or mistreated when traveling in first class. All of them mention you." She shook her head frantically. I didn't." Daniel didn't let her finish. "Mrs. Lawson was the final straw. The fact that this played out publicly on video means we can't ignore it anymore." She felt the world closing in. Not just today, not just this one mistake. Her entire past was crashing down on her. "We've made our decision," Daniel said, his voice final. Madison's heart stopped. Patricia slid one last document in front of her. Her termination notice. "This is your official dismissal from the airline," Daniel said, "effective immediately." Her ears rang. The words barely registered. She couldn't move. "You will not be allowed to serve on any future flights. Your access to company systems has already been revoked." No, this wasn't happening. She had given this airline 10 years. She had worked hard, followed policy. One mistake, one misunderstanding, shouldn't erase everything. Her vision blurred as she stared at the paper. Your final paycheck will be processed within 2 weeks, Patricia added. It felt so cold, like she was nothing to them, like she had never mattered at all. Daniel's gaze softened slightly. Miss Reed, you have the right to appeal, but given the public nature of this incident, I strongly advise against it. Because they knew. They all knew. There was nothing left to fight for. Her hand shook as she picked up the pen. She barely saw the words, barely felt the ink stain her name onto the page. But when she set the pen down, it was over. Daniel took the document, neatly placing it back into the folder. Like sealing a coffin. You are free to go, he said, standing. Security stepped forward, ready to escort her out. She was being walked out of the airline like a criminal. Her legs felt weak as she rose to her feet. She turned toward the door, toward the end of everything. But before she stepped out, Daniel spoke one last time. Miss Reed, he said, voice softer now. She hesitated. I hope you take this time to reflect, he said, because today wasn't just about your career. It was about the kind of person you have been and the kind of person you'll choose to be moving forward. Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to scream, to defend herself, but instead she just nodded silently and walked out the door. As she stepped into the main airport terminal, the air felt different, like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. People were watching her, recognizing her. Her face had been plastered all over social media. She was the flight attendant from the viral video, the woman who had assumed, the woman who had been wrong. Her stomach twisted as she caught a reflection of herself in a glass window. Her once pristine uniform felt like a lie now, a symbol of authority she no longer had. She looked small. For the first time in her life, she truly understood what it felt like to be powerless. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another news notification, another headline. She didn't check it. She already knew what it would say, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she let herself cry. What do you think? Should Madison have been fired? Or does she deserve a second chance? Comment below and let us know your thoughts. Like to support fairness for all passengers. Eudora Lawson sat quietly in the backseat of the town car, her hands resting gently in her lap as the vehicle pulled away from the airport. The city lights flickered against the window, reflecting in her tired eyes. She had barely spoken since stepping off the plane, since walking past the flashing cameras and murmuring reporters, since watching Madison Reed be escorted away. Her heart felt heavy. She had never set out to ruin anyone's life. She had never wanted this to become a national scandal. All she had wanted was to sit in the seat she had paid for without being questioned, without being judged, without being made to feel like she didn't belong. But now everything had spiraled into something much bigger than herself. She inhaled slowly, letting the cool air of the car fill her lungs, but it did little to quiet the storm inside her. This wasn't the first time she had been looked at like she didn't belong. It wasn't the first time she had been questioned. It wasn't the first time she had been made to feel like she had to prove her worth in a space where others walked freely, unquestioned. But it was the first time the whole world had seen it happen, and that changed everything. She thought back to the moment Madison had stood over her, arms crossed, voice clipped with impatience and quiet authority. Are you sure you didn't mean to sit in the main cabin? The words still rang in her ears, not just because of what was said, but because of what wasn't, because of what was assumed. Eudora had spent her life brushing off moments like that, swallowing the discomfort, choosing silence over confrontation, because confronting it meant inviting conflict, because speaking up meant being labeled as difficult, because the world had always expected people like her to take the slight and move on. But not this time. Her phone buzzed in her purse. More messages, more calls. She knew the video had spread far beyond that plane. She had seen the headlines, heard the news anchors discussing it, read the outpouring of support from strangers who had never met her, but felt her story deep in their bones. Elderly woman humiliated on first-class flight. Another case of bias in the airline industry. Passengers rally behind woman unfairly questioned mid-flight. She never wanted to be a symbol. She never wanted to be the face of yet another conversation about injustice. But here she was. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. People were outraged, not just for her, but for all the people who had been questioned and dismissed before her. For the ones who had been forced to switch seats, who had been asked to show their tickets twice, who had been escorted off flights without explanation simply because someone had assumed they didn't belong. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. And then there was Madison Reed. Eudora could still see the woman's pale, frozen face as she was led away, the weight of public disgrace hanging over her like a storm cloud. She had seen Madison's fear, her shock, the dawning realization that she was not untouchable. She had seen people lose jobs before. She had seen young black men fired over minor mistakes, seen women passed over for promotions for being too assertive, seen good workers dismissed over misunderstandings with no second chances. But had Madison ever worried about that before today? Had she ever feared that one mistake could cost her everything? Probably not. And now Madison was experiencing something Eudora knew all too well, what it felt like to be at the mercy of a system that had already decided her fate. Eudora didn't feel happy about it. She didn't feel victorious. But she knew that accountability mattered. She knew that if she had let this moment pass, if she had ignored it, shrugged it off, let Madison continue without consequence, then nothing would have changed. And she knew in her bones that change was long overdue. A moment that sparked something bigger. As the car slowed at a red light, Eudora glanced out the window, watching as people walked along the sidewalks, oblivious to the storm she had just lived through. She wondered how many of them had seen the video. She wondered if any of them had ever been questioned for existing in a space someone else thought they didn't belong in. Maybe they had, maybe they hadn't. But she hoped that after today they would think about it more. She hoped that Madison would think about it more. She hoped that the airline executives who had been forced to take action would think about it more. Because this wasn't just about one flight attendant. This was about a culture that had allowed people like Madison to act without fear of consequences. And maybe, just maybe, that culture was finally changing. Eudora closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in her chest. Then she reached for her phone. She wasn't going to stay silent anymore. She wasn't going to let this moment fade away like so many others before it. She opened her messages, then scrolled to the one from a young journalist who had reached out earlier. She hit reply. Maybe she would tell her story. Maybe she would speak up. Maybe for the first time in her life, she would make sure that this moment didn't just fade into another forgotten headline. Because people needed to see this. Because people needed to care. Because the only way the world changed was when people refused to let things go back to the way they were. The world kept moving. The scandal faded from the headlines. The airline moved on, issuing corporate apologies and promising reforms. New training programs were introduced. Policies were rewritten. Flight attendants across the industry were briefed on the importance of fair treatment for all passengers. But for the people at the heart of it, Eudora Lawson and Madison Reed, this story would never truly fade away. This was not just about a seat on an airplane. It was not just about one flight attendant's mistake or one passenger's quiet resilience. It was about the power of perception, the danger of unchecked bias, and the moment when accountability met consequence. Eudora had spent a lifetime navigating a world that saw her as a question mark rather than an answer. And now she had unknowingly become a symbol, not just for herself, but for so many others who had been dismissed, doubted, and denied their place. She hadn't wanted this attention. She hadn't wanted to be a headline. But as she sat on her porch weeks later, watching the golden afternoon sun dip below the trees, she realized something important. Maybe the world needed to see this. The calls hadn't stopped after she left the airport that day. Journalists, lawyers, activists, even airline executives, all wanting to talk, all wanting her opinion. For the first few days, she had ignored them. She wasn't some civil rights leader or public speaker. She was just a retired school teacher who had wanted a peaceful flight. But after some thought, after sitting down with her granddaughter Amara, after talking to the people who had supported her, after reading the thousands of messages from strangers who shared their own stories, she decided to speak. Not for revenge, not for fame, but because if she didn't, the world would move on without learning anything at all. And so Eudora sat in front of a camera one evening, her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady but warm, and told her story, not just about the flight, but about her entire life. She spoke about the moments when she had been made to feel invisible. She spoke about watching her students face discrimination, about the quiet battles she had fought as a young teacher, about how she had spent a lifetime making herself smaller to avoid confrontation. And then she spoke about the day she chose not to be silent. The video went viral. People listened. People learned. People cared. For weeks, Madison disappeared from public view. The airline had terminated her employment within days of the incident, and with the entire internet watching, she found herself unable to escape the consequences of her actions. At first, she was angry. She felt like she had been unfairly made an example of, like she had been thrown under the bus to protect the airline's reputation. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to defend herself, but no one was listening. And deep down, she knew why. For the first time in her life, Madison understood what it felt like to have no power. She wasn't used to that. She had always been the one giving orders, the one in control, the one who never had to explain herself. Now she was the one being judged, and that changed her. She spent the first few weeks reading the comments online, feeling the weight of people's disappointment, their anger, their disbelief. Then one day she did something she had never done before. She sat down, opened a blank document, and started writing an apology. Not for corporate PR, not to save face, but because she had spent her entire life seeing herself as the authority in every room, and now she had to learn what it meant to be wrong. She sent it to Eudora. She didn't expect a response, but Eudora did respond, and her words were simple. People only change when they decide to. I hope you do. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation to forget, but it was a door, and Madison chose to walk through it. She started attending bias awareness workshops. She listened to the voices of people she had never paid attention to before. She learned about the small, seemingly harmless ways discrimination played out in daily life, not always with malice, but through assumptions, unchecked authority, and subtle dismissals. And for the first time, she saw herself in those lessons. She wasn't the victim of a public scandal. She was the lesson, and she was ready to learn. This story isn't just about Eudora's dignity or Madison's downfall. It's about all of us. It's about the assumptions we make, the power dynamics we enforce, the ways we either choose to speak up or stay silent. Because the truth is, we all have moments where we hold power over someone else. And in those moments, we have a choice. Do we use that power with fairness and humility? Or do we use it to dismiss, to control, to decide who belongs and who doesn't? This story could have been different. If Madison had simply asked to see Eudora's ticket with respect rather than assumption. If she had taken 2 extra seconds to verify rather than judge. If she had been willing to admit her mistake immediately rather than doubling down and making it worse. But that didn't happen. And because of that, a quiet moment turned into a global conversation, a lesson in power, perception, and prejudice. So the question is, what would you do in that moment? Would you assume? Would you judge? Would you stay silent when you see it happening to someone else? Or would you be like Eudora, dignified, unshaken, unwilling to be erased? Would you be like Celeste, the one who spoke up and took action? Would you be like Frederick, the man who challenged what he saw as wrong? Or will you, like Madison, wait until it's too late to realize that the power you think you have can be taken away in an instant? The choice is yours. But remember, the world is watching. And how you treat people, especially when you think no one is looking, defines who you are. If you believe in fairness and dignity for all, hit the like button to support Eudora's strength and grace. Comment below. Have you ever been unfairly judged? What did you do? Let's start a conversation. And if you want to hear more powerful stories that challenge the way we see the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because these stories need to be told. And because together we can create a world where moments like this no longer happen.